Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on street openings and school streets. Hopefully you can all hear me. Can I just quickly ask, you do have a chat button on the bottom of your screens. If you could just maybe type to say whether you can hear me or not. Just as a double check. Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you for those people who did. That's great. So the webinar on street openings and school streets, which is really about how we can design our streets around people and not around cars, which are relatively harmful to both people and our environment. My name is Alan Wong from the University of Southampton, and I'm joined by Carolyn Ireland from Southampton City Council and Joe Bigwood from Sustrans. We're also accompanied by Hannah Chivers from the City Council, who will be our moderator for today, and she will be opening up the floor for a question and answer session after the more formal part of this webinar is over in about half an hour. In the meantime, feel free to join in the test group chat, which I've referred to earlier, that you should see at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions as we go along, and Hannah will then try to gather those, so we'll try and cover those questions first. What we're going to talk about is founded on the work of the EU Horizon 2020 Metamorphosis Project, which involves 12 partners and 7 European cities to create child-friendly neighborhoods and design more accessible public spaces and shared streets for people, especially for our children, to make our cities more livable and encourage greater connectivity through walking and cycling rather than the unfair priority which is often given to cars and other motorized vehicles today. And of course, if you Google the term friendly neighborhood, this is the guy you normally get, which is very appropriate for a webinar, especially as this is a child version of Spider-Man. But what we're going to show you more seriously is that you don't need to be a superhero in order to change our cities. We can make all the difference if we work together with our communities and with the support from our municipal councils. So what are we going to cover today? Well, first, I'm going to give you a quick summary of the Metamorphosis Project. Then I'm going to describe what the community street openings, which includes closing the streets to cars, as well as the use of school streets, are theoretically about, which helps to make the streets and our public spaces safer. I'm also going to discuss why we need more of them in our cities today, if we're to create more child-friendly neighborhoods. Then Carolyn will talk about how we collectively achieve some of these schemes in Southampton through a combination of policy changes and providing training and other support to the local community groups, including the available tools and resources. So, what is the Metamorphosis Project about, or what makes it different? Well, it's about creating an ethos or culture around children and creating child-friendly neighborhoods. After all, sustainability implies doing it for our children, yet they rarely get a voice. They're not voters, for example. And when they do, it can be done superficially, whereas the Metamorphosis Project has sought to engage children in an authentic way, for example, through co-design workshops, and the feedback is very, very important. The project also recognizes that children can also act as great enablers for change. Think Greta, for example, really be an inspiration for people to do things because she's passionate about it. And we should recognize that a 9-year-old child tends to look at the world at around 1.2 meters. And the view at that level is very different to ours. Yet urban planning is often done to a large or grand scale, using the so-called strategic or master plan that often exists in many cities. And this really warrants some changing. And I think the challenge for us is also shown in this picture, where we have a perverse situation in many of our cities in that local regulations dictate it is not okay for our children to use parking spaces for playing, yet it is fine if we go and play in their parked cars. This space injustice being allocated to cars and for parking rather than giving our children the freedom to play is even more perverse, when research suggests that cars are typically only used from around 5% to 20% of the time. The rest of the time, they're actually stationary or parked, either at home, at work, the shops, or the gym, for example. So this devotion to parking cannot really be effective use of public space in our cities, especially not when that same space is often considered a premium. So we're going to look to change some of that, which is what the Metamorphosis Project is all about. And hopefully after hearing some of this webinar, you will feel inspired to do so too, particularly with some of the specific examples that we're going to touch on. And you'll be able to differentiate between community street openings or closures and school streets, which we think are a much more child-friendly and efficient way of using public space. And you will hopefully understand some of the reasons why we need more of these interventions and what needs to be done to make community street openings and school streets successful, as well as some of the other things that need to be put into place to create more child-friendly streets and neighborhoods as a whole. So what are community street openings and school streets? Although they both involve street closures to cars, there are actually some subtle differences between the two types of initiatives. Community street openings, i.e. closing the street to cars but opening out the community, typically involve temporary closures, although there should be scope for these closures to recur on a regular basis, either once a week or once a month or once a year. For example, things like holiday streets, or indeed streets for people to play, i.e. play streets. They typically involve a local traffic regulation order, which is within the power of the city council for them to close the road and make it safer for the community to play in. They're often accompanied, as we shall see later, by other public space interventions, which can make the street more colourful, including street art, music, and other activities that really encourage local social interventions. And the purpose behind these is really to build community cohesion, making streets and public spaces safer, yet fun and accessible to everyone, while linking the community to facilities such as a local school, areas of interest, as well as shops, and encouraging active travel between these places and more healthier lifestyles. School streets are similar, but they serve a specific purpose. They're typically time closures. For example, in Southampton, they typically occur for 45 minutes before and after the school starts and ends. And the reason being is because during those hours, for people that drive anyway, they will notice the volume of traffic really significantly increases. And the research shows that often can be more than 30% of the total traffic on the network during school opening and closure hours. So it's really there to act as a deterrent by closing the street next or close to the school and encouraging people to walk and cycle there. And it really discourages the highly disproportionate number of short journeys that arises because of school traffic, because often these journeys, particularly in primary schools, are for people who live within a mile or two of the school itself. And in addition to that, it really improves local air quality because there's often more congestion around these schools, and parents can sometimes wait in their cars and keep the engine running while they're doing that. So there's harmful pollutants coming out that can really deter and be harmful and really quite obnoxious and difficult and toxic to both children and for families. And of course, often parents misbehave. So they can park on the curb, they can park together, they can block entrances. So school streets are also there principally for safety, to reduce the number of accidents near the school entrances generally. And there'll be examples of school street trials that are run in Sholing and the eastern parts of Southampton and St John's that Carolyn and Joe will talk about shortly. So why do we need more of these interventions? Sorry, there's possibly too many words on this slide, but actually that just goes to show there are actually many reasons for doing this. Sorry, we seem to have got the camera back and working. We had a bit of a technical glitch, possibly. Anyway, historically, there are many reasons why there's been a growth in car traffic, which is generally seen to be harmful for people. Particularly in terms of air quality and in terms of the dioxides of nitrogen or NOx and particulate matter or PM. We know, and the medical profession generally agree on this, that they're particularly harmful for people, and breathing in these obnoxious gases which are toxic to human beings, as well as ultrafine particles which can get into our lungs, into our cardiovascular system, can actually make us weak, and it's particularly bad for our children because breathing it in through the stages of development, they may not have fully developed as yet, and so these things can be carcinogenic, as well as causing asthma and breathing difficulty for our children. So they're bad for people generally, then they're even worse for children. So the growth in cars and the exhaust pollutions that results as a consequence, which is spewing out into our atmosphere, causing poor air quality, as well as actually smog and loads of other chemical reactions that causes even further pollution in our cities, is really, really, really bad. And in addition, the volume of cars can deter people from walking because it's not particularly pleasant, nor is it good for cycling because people are weary of many cars on the road and having a perception that actually is quite dangerous to cycle. And in addition, the growth in car traffic and really opening up the main roads to cars often segments our neighborhoods so that actually, if you're an older person, for example, it's difficult to cross from one side of a neighborhood to another side of the neighborhood, and that might result in social isolation and people not integrating and segmentation of our people. So actually, generally, this growth in car use and putting our streets over to cars and giving them priority is generally not a good thing. However, we've also found from government studies, including the local Sustainable Transport Fund and similar studies, it's actually difficult to get people out of their cars and more walk and cycle, because nudging them or having behavioral change programs in themselves often don't work. They need to be complemented by infrastructure improvements, or as we will come to, things like street openings and small streets to really try and deter people from driving to where they need to be. And in order to do this, we really need a whole population to do that, and not just the proportion that are already keen on walking and cycling. And sometimes it may be difficult to challenge those who are wedded to their cars or for whatever reason can't do without, for example, if they have to chip chain. And we also need to raise greater awareness of how the community can actually own their public spaces and their streets, so they take the pride of place and use that space to how they want to. So in essence, really, we need to be able to imagine or reimagine our streets without cars. So I'm now going to hand over to Carolyn, who will talk about how we achieve that in practice.
Yes, so I talk a bit about how we have achieved more street openings in Southampton. So the initial thing that we did was change the policy or introduce a policy called community street closures or openings, which allows residents to close their own street much more simply than previously. They can do it for various purposes. So there's three main purposes, which are for playing out, so for child play in the street, for community events, or for street parties. So obviously that covers a wide range of things. It's absolutely free for people to apply and to hold the closure as long as they get it in with about 6 weeks notice. The closure can be repeated up to weekly throughout the year. So in the past, people have wanted to hold various closures throughout the year. That would have been lots of applications for lots of different closures. This one, if they want to do a weekly or monthly closure, they can just do one application for the calendar year. It's a shorter lead-in time than the standard TTRO. So as I say, 6 weeks notice if you want a free closure. There's ways of getting it in a bit sooner than that as well. The application itself is fairly simplified, so just need you do have to consult with the residents just to make sure that there's no major objections to it, but that you cannot object to the closure just through principle of not wanting to close your street. It would just only be if it's going to block an emergency exit or something like that. And also with this kind of closure, there's no need for police or other authorities to be on site. So the community can run it on their own, use some fairly light touch measures to close the roads. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but don't need necessarily the official hard signage, cones, etc. So that's the policy change. On top of that, we did some training for community groups and for local people who were particularly interested in closing their own streets in the city. So we had Playing Out come along, who are a national organisation encouraging people to close the streets to allow child play. They helped us run a workshop specifically on how to close your street in Southampton and why, and how to get your neighbours involved, and the practicalities of running it. Then we have a new section of the City Council website which simplifies, again has been simplified, but runs through how you should apply, how you should speak to your neighbours, etc. And we plan to develop that a bit more. And then we also have a couple of community champions who have already held their own closures, who are still holding their own regular closures, because there's some people doing some residential closures or street openings throughout the winter, so they can help out other community groups and other residents. And then so on top of the training, we've got some tools and resources as well. So we want to make it as simple as possible for people to close their own local streets. So we've got some flexible signage, as you see in the picture, the road closed one, which we lend out free. So we've got 3 at the moment, community centres in different parts of the city which host that signage, which you can borrow from for a closure. They're lightweight, you can stick them on your bike or whatever, and like a standard metal sign. We're going to get a few more resources, so we'll get some high-vis and some whistles, those kind of things people can borrow. We've got some balance bike, we've got 2 balance bike libraries in the city, so people can borrow balance bikes and also small pedal bikes for free. So when the street is closed, kids are then able to learn to ride a bike or to practice, or just to have something a bit more fun and free to do. And in the future, we may look at offering some small pots of funding if anyone has any revolutionary ideas that might help us spread this across the city. So far this year, we've had 25 applications, but that could cover, I don't know exactly how many closures that includes, because some of them are for repeated weekly, monthly closures. But if you apply for a repeated closure, you don't have to hold it. So if you've applied for a weekly one and it's terrible weather one day, you don't have to continue with it, but it just gives you that freedom to be able to play out or to hold a community event on a regular basis. So that is street openings, and I will hand over to Joe, who's going to talk a bit about school streets.
Yeah, thanks. So school streets obviously isn't a new idea. Street closures happening in partnership with schools have been happening for many years. We've been doing them at Sustrans, often paired with design work for a number of years across the UK. But it is something that has come to the fore in the last 18 months to 2 years, I think everyone would agree. And in March this year, Sustrans decided, as part of the launch of our annual Big Pedal competition, we would do a day of school streets, and we did school street events at over 40 schools across the UK, all on the same day. And down here in Southampton, we had 4 events, which was, I think, the most of any local authority, which was very pleasing. And it was quite an undertaking, but it was achieved through some various stages of careful planning. Obviously, engagement was key to that, and different stages of engagement are key, not only on a large scale event where you're doing a number of street closures, but if you're doing any kind of school street event. Firstly, with local authorities, enthusiasm for the project comes in handy. That was evident in Southampton already, who we knew were supportive of school streets, and as Carolyn's already mentioned, have put legislation in place to make it easier for them to happen. So we were able to use the community street orders to do these school street events. But yeah, working with the local authority was certainly the first stage, making sure that we had support from council staff, but also from local councillors. Then obviously there's working with the schools. So school identification, when it comes to school streets, there's a fair few things that, depending on where you are and what you need in place, needs to be taken into account. So there's the geography of the school. So unfortunately, some schools are still going to have barriers such as bus routes going through them or key routes for emergency vehicles, which makes it not really feasible for these type of events. And other schools particularly lend themselves to them. So that's something that we took into account. Then obviously, again, with the schools, as with the local authorities, enthusiasm for these type of events is key. This isn't the kind of project that you do with a school that has been reticent about engaging in active travel promotion. You need full support from as many people in the school as you can. So certainly it's a case of working with the willing when it comes to school streets. Then, should you be lucky enough, once you've worked through those, to have a number of candidates that could be locations for school streets, then you've got to obviously look at which school would benefit the most at that time from that kind of event. And that may be, you can look at various factors with that. You may look at any road traffic incidents around there, or you may look at air quality. There's lots of different criteria that could affect that thought. But one of the key ones, I think, is legacy, which we'll come on to in a bit. But legacy, if there's a possibility of more interventions in the future and it's not just going to be a one-off, then that certainly, I would say, is a reason for picking a school for one of these school streets events. Then, once you've got the local authority and the schools on board, there's the small matter of the residents and the parents and the wider community. So often engagement with these stakeholders is a statutory element of street closure arrangements. That varies. Every local authority is different in terms of what you need to do there. But even if it wasn't a statutory element, I certainly believe that is something that you should do anyway, because if you can get the support of not only the parents at the school, but the residents in the local area, then you're halfway towards winning the battle to make these measures more permanent. And so obviously things like letters go out to residents. We also had consultation events, so like coffee mornings and drop-in sessions for people to come along and find out what school streets were, what was going to happen. Most of the queries were about things like access on the day when there's closures, and they were normally easily handled because we had measures in place to deal with those. And it should be said as well that parents are a key audience in any consultation to do with schools, because obviously the children are normally extremely enthusiastic about these kind of events. But if you can persuade the parents, then they're the ones who are going to be making the choices about those school journeys, particularly for the younger children. With regards to resourcing these events, so our school streets events in March, we were pretty ambitious with the amount we held, and undeniably it was pretty resource intensive. To put on that many events in a day was a push, but even putting on one school street can be pretty intensive in terms of the people you need on there. So volunteers were really helpful for us. Sustrans has a long history of working with volunteers. We're really lucky in those terms. But also we have parent volunteers, local residents, and obviously we had our partners from the local authority working with us as well. And in terms of the results of these school streets, the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. In Southampton, so these are the results just for our Southampton schools, 92% of residents felt that the space outside the school was safer. 82% agreed that it was more child-friendly. 72% of parents who usually drive said that the school environment was more enjoyable. And a massive 93% supported more regular closures. And that brings me on to the legacy. So obviously one-off events are fantastic and they raise awareness of what you can do by changing the space outside of school. And they encourage parents to try and different routines and have a go at active travel, cycling, scooting, walking, whatever. But if you can then repeat these events and it starts to become the norm, that's when you start to make the real changes. So we're lucky in Southampton in that we're now working with one school who we've already had another 2 events since March with them, and we're going to be putting in a longer term temporary street closure. And that will mean that, yes, there won't be the celebrations every day, there won't be all of the games out on the street that you see that were fantastic fun, but it becomes the norm. It just becomes the way it is outside the school, and that's one of the key benefits that we hope to demonstrate with these. So I'll hand back to Carolyn now, who's going to talk about the showing events.
Yes, so the community street closures, I've mentioned a bit how they have been useful for the local community to close their street, but also changing the policy has been a useful tool for us as a local authority to engage the community and to make change to their own environment. So obviously we made use of the policy change for school streets, as Joe said, but also I won't go too much into detail on the Showing Child-Friendly Streets project. We are going to talk a bit more about the co-design process in our second webinar. But this is a project we did in collaboration with Sustrans, engaging the local community through the school and the community hub and residents throughout the space of a year to make some more some temporary trial designs with a view to making the space in the local area a bit more child-friendly. It's a kind of short summary. But we use street closures, as I say, as a tool to engage the local community. So once we had held lots of community consultation and co-creation and co-design workshops, we then trialled those designs on the street. So we closed the street for the day or for a few hours to do what we call a street trial, as you can see in the photos up here. So it gave us a chance to trial designs that with a view to potentially making them a bit more permanent. So using things like street chalk, where we can trial a colourful crossing outside the school, which is just a visual sign that you're entering an area where there are going to be children. So to obviously slow down, to be aware that children might be crossing. These street trials we ran together with the school itself and the local community hub. So the school came out and took part in activities on the street. The children helped us fill the planters, and throughout the street trial we were also getting feedback from the residents, the parents and the children about what they thought about the designs and any way that we might need to change them in the more permanent implementation. After the street trial, these street chalk and the Sustrans street kit, which is this colourful modular kit you can see in the pavement on the photo on the right hand side, stayed in place for a period of weeks, so people could see what impact it would have at different times of day, different days of the week, and then give some more feedback again at the end of the trial.
Okay, for sort of time reasons, we were going to touch on a little bit more around the built environment, but we're going to cover more of that in the next webinar, which will follow this one. But really, for the purpose of time, I just want to now run through, hopefully that you found the theory and the principles behind the Metamorphosis Project in terms of how we go about developing more child-friendly streets and neighborhoods in our cities, why we need them, and how we have achieved this through community street openings and school streets that Carolyn and Joe both spoke about, as well as sort of the specific interventions associated with that they put into public space, and how they've gone about working with the communities, with the council, and vice versa, in a bottom-up approach that involves children authentically in the co-creation process. So really, this slide is just a quick recap on the learning outcomes, which hopefully you will have achieved. And to close, we're now going to show you a short 2-minute video to give you a run-through of one of the school street trials we ran here in Southampton, just to get a sense of, or flavour of what it's like. Sorry, we're just trying to see if it's showing on the other screen at the moment.
School drop-off and pick-up times, there's normally massive congestion outside of schools. With that congestion comes poor air quality, and it makes the air outside of school quite a toxic environment. We're closing the streets outside of 39 schools across the whole country and 6 schools in Southampton. So what we're doing by closing the streets, letting people experience what it's like, have a school closure, a street closure at the drop-off and pick-up time, so that more people can feel happy, spending time in the streets and playing. People feel more able to walk and cycle to these places as well, rather than thinking they've got to be in their car because it's too dangerous.
At the end of the day, having all those children on the road, playing, the parents involved, I saw people dance, drawing pictures together and writing little memos to each other. They've been really enthusiastic about it, and they've really bounced off each other.
My journey programme is all about helping to get people around the city easier by promoting walking and cycling. So we work with schools and workplaces and community groups.
And so seeing children out in the streets enjoying themselves is a really nice thing in the city centre, because you don't see it very often. So yeah, it's been amazing from that side of it.
So thank you for listening. These are our contact details. Should you need to get in touch with us, as well as our social media. Almost there. We have had a few teething problems today, but hopefully you can see that on the slide. As I say, I'm still here, Alan Wong, with Carolyn Ireland from the City Council and Joe Bigwood from Sustrans.